It is 3 in the morning on the island of Guadalcanal, October 26, 1942, and Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige is the last man on the ridge. Around him, 33 Marines are dead or wounded. The 4 water-cooled Browning machine guns his section had set up in the dark are down to 1 still firing, and the one that is firing is the one he is feeding by himself. His left hand has been opened by a bayonet. The blood is dark and warm in the tropical dark, and he has no time to stop it. Shapes are moving through the grass below the ridgeline. Close now. Close enough that he can hear the sound of equipment moving and men moving in a language he does not understand and does not need to understand. He swings the gun. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He fires. He swings again. When the belt runs out, he finds another. At some point the gun he is on is destroyed by enemy fire, and he leaves it and finds another and starts again. There is nobody to his left. There is nobody to his right. There is nobody behind him on this particular piece of ground. He does not have an accurate count of what is below him in the jungle. The figure that gets cited most often in popular accounts, in the documentaries, in the channel titles and the retellings, is 4,000. The actual regiment committed to his sector that night numbered roughly 2,500 by most post-war estimates, drawn from an enveloping force of over 5,600 infantry moving against the entire southern face of the American perimeter. The difference between those numbers is worth examining honestly, and this story will. Because the real count, the documented count, the count that requires no inflation, is already extraordinary enough. This is the story of Mitchell Paige, Platoon Sergeant, Company H, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division. This is the story of a ridge near the Matanacaw River on an island most Americans had never heard of. On a night in October 1942, when the outcome of the campaign, and by some reasonable measure the direction of the Pacific War, came down to one man's refusal to leave a gun. To understand what Paige was doing on that ridge, you first have to understand what Henderson Field was, and why men on both sides of the Pacific War were willing to die for it in numbers that still resist easy calculation. Guadalcanal is one of the southern Solomon Islands, a narrow landmass in the southwestern Pacific roughly 90 miles long and about 25 miles wide at its broadest, covered almost entirely by dense equatorial jungle, volcanic ridgelines, and heat that does not relent at any hour of any day. The jungle floor is in permanent shadow. The rivers run brown. The coastal plain is a narrow strip of coconut palms between the hills and the sea. Visibility in the inland jungle rarely exceeds a few yards in any direction. Malaria, scrub typhus, and dysentery were not wartime inconveniences on Guadalcanal. They were forces on the battlefield. Before any rifle was fired, the island itself was attriting both sides. Before the summer of 1942, Guadalcanal was unremarkable. In the spring of that year, the Japanese began building an airfield on its northern coastal plain near the mouth of a river called the Lunga. They understood what that airfield would mean. A land-based aviation platform in the southern Solomons could project air power far enough south to threaten the sea lanes connecting the United States to Australia. It could support naval operations down through the island chain. It could extend the defensive perimeter of the Japanese Empire far enough to make Allied shipping across the central and southwestern Pacific acutely vulnerable. The Americans saw the same thing and drew the same conclusion from the opposite direction. In July 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur reached an agreement to strike before the Japanese airfield could be made operational. On August 7, 1942, roughly 11,000 Marines came ashore on Guadalcanal and the neighboring islands of Tulagi and Gavudatamimbogo. It was the first major Allied ground offensive of the Pacific War. Within 36 hours, the Marines had seized the half-finished Japanese airstrip. They named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway 2 months before. What followed was a grinding, months-long contest for a strip of packed coral and dirt in the middle of the Pacific. The Japanese were not willing to concede an airfield they had built. The Marines were not willing to surrender one they had bled to take. Both sides poured resources into the island through a channel between the two island chains that the Americans called the Slot. The Japanese ran fast destroyers down it at night in operations that came to be known as the Tokyo Express, unloading troops under cover of dark, so Allied aircraft based at Henderson could not intercept them. The Marines flew fighter-bombers off Henderson Field by day to contest the warships and bombers and transports that came against them. These aircraft, drawn from Marine, Navy, and Army Air Forces units, flew under the collective call sign Cactus, and they were what the airfield was for. As long as Cactus Air Force was operational, the Japanese could not move large, slow transport ships to Guadalcanal in daylight. The airfield was not a symbol. It was a weapons system, and the loss of it would have fundamentally altered the strategic equation in the southwestern Pacific. The Marines who held it were suffering. By October 1942, after 2 months on Guadalcanal, malaria had infected a significant portion of the garrison. The Marine Corps reported that at any given time during September and October, roughly a third of the men defending the perimeter were sick to some degree. Rations were inadequate and irregular. The heat ran past 90 degrees most days with humidity that made the air feel solid. The insects were relentless. Fungal infections crept through feet and hands that were never fully dry. Japanese destroyers came in most nights, shelling the airfield and the perimeter, and the men learned to sleep through the shelling or not to sleep at all. They had fought 2 previous major Japanese ground offensives and stopped both. The first serious attack on the perimeter in late August had ended when a Japanese force under Colonel Kiyono Ichiki was annihilated on the sandbar of the Tenaru River. Ichiki's force had attacked the Marine lines with bayonets and was cut apart by automatic weapons and artillery, with survivors trapped in a coconut grove and finished by tanks in the morning. It was the kind of action that taught the Japanese something about what the Marines were capable of, though the lesson did not prevent them from trying again. The second major assault came in mid-September at what became known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, a long bare ridgeline running toward Henderson Field from the south. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Raider Battalion, held the ridge through 2 nights of assault by the Kawaguchi Brigade with a force of roughly 800 Marines. The Japanese came in repeated waves with bayonets fixed. Edson's men held the tip of the ridge at its narrowest point, with gaps in the line and Japanese infiltrators working through the dark around them. They held it. When the sun came up the second morning, the ridge was covered in Japanese dead, and the airfield was still in American hands. Edson was awarded the Medal of Honor for what he did on that ridge. After each of these battles, the Japanese reorganized, reinforced, and planned again. The Marines buried their dead, treated their wounded, dealt with the malaria that was working through the command as steadily as any offensive, and went back to digging. They had stopped 2 assaults. They were not certain they could stop a third. By mid-October, the Japanese had brought up battleships to bombard Henderson Field directly. The battleships Congo and Haruna arrived in the waters north of the island on the night of October 13th and 14th and fired nearly 914-inch shells into the airfield and the surrounding area in 90 minutes. Most of the aviation fuel was destroyed. Most of the aircraft were damaged or wrecked. The men in the perimeter who lived through the bombardment described it in terms that suggested a fundamental redefinition of what it was possible to survive. The Cactus Air Force flew reduced operations in the days that followed, scraping fuel from drums and flying what aircraft could be repaired. The question of whether Henderson Field could be held had become, for a brief period, genuinely open. The question was whether the Marines could stop a third major ground assault on the airfield they had named for a man killed at Midway. Mitchell Paige was born August 31, 1918, in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, a town on the Monongahela River about 20 miles south of Pittsburgh, built on steel mills and river commerce. His parents had come from Serbia, part of the wave of immigrants from southeastern Europe who had come to the Pennsylvania mill towns in the early years of the century to work in the furnaces and the coke ovens and the rolling mills that the region ran on. His father worked. His mother kept the household and raised the children and wrote Bible verses in the margins of the small Bible she would eventually give her son when he left for the Marine Corps. He grew up watching the annual Armistice Day Parade, the one where the veterans of the Great War marched down the main street in their ribbon-decorated uniforms, and something in that ceremony took hold of him young. He respected what they had done. He wanted to do something comparable. By the time he finished high school in 1936, the decision was already made. He turned 18 and hitchhiked more than 200 miles to the recruiting station in Baltimore to enlist. The recruiter gave him some initial difficulty about being underweight, by one account, and he resolved it by the kind of persistence that would characterize the rest of his career. He was in the Marine Corps. His departure from Charleroi was so abrupt, in the way that 18-year-olds sometimes make decisive choices, that the Eagle Scout Award he had earned in his final year of high school was never formally presented to him. He did not receive it until 2003, 67 years later, a few months before he died. From Paris Island, he was sent to the Philippines in 1937. In the Philippines, he played baseball. His pitching record in the service leagues there was, by the account preserved in the records, remarkable. 55 wins against 17 losses over the course of his time there. It is the kind of detail that seems unrelated to everything that comes later, but is actually the same fact stated differently. A man who is methodical about the mechanics of what he does, who practices a physical skill until it becomes automatic, who performs under pressure because he has done the preparation that makes performance possible. In 1938, he was sent to Peking, China, where he joined the Marine detachment guarding the American embassy in what was by then a city under effective Japanese occupation. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun the previous summer. The Japanese were fighting their way into the Chinese interior with a systematic brutality that would later be documented in detail by historians and by the testimony of survivors. Paige served as an armed guard on supply trains running between Shanghai and Peking through a countryside that the Japanese army was working through methodically. From the windows of a moving train he watched, at intervals, what was being done to the population of the towns and villages the Japanese held. He saw soldiers kill civilians. He saw what an occupying force looks like when it has decided that restraint is unnecessary. It was his first sustained encounter with the Japanese military in operation, and it did not leave him. He said later that by the time he reached Guadalcanal, he had a precise understanding of what he was fighting and why. He left China in 1940, came back to the United States, and was folded into the newly created 1st Marine Division under then Major General Alexander Vandegrift. He was assigned to the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marine Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Herman Hannikin. For months after Pearl Harbor, the division began moving forward. In September 1942, the 7th Marines landed on Guadalcanal. By mid-October, the Japanese were ready to commit their most serious effort yet against Henderson Field. The man given command of the main assault was Major General Masao Maruyama, and his instrument was the 2nd Infantry Division, known throughout the Japanese Army as the Sendai Division because most of its men had been recruited in Miyagi Prefecture in northern Japan, where the city of Sendai gave the division its name. The Sendai Division was not a second-line garrison formation. It had an established record in China and in the early Pacific campaigns. The men who marched with it had been soldiers for years. Maruyama knew what he had and what he intended to do with it. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hayakatake, commanding the 17th Army, had assembled the largest ground force yet directed at Henderson Field. The plan called for a coordinated assault from multiple directions simultaneously, with Maruyama's division executing the main enveloping blow from the south. To reach the jump-off position for the southern assault, Maruyama's force had to move approximately 15 miles through what the official U.S. Army history of Guadalcanal describes as terrain covered in giant hardwood trees, vines, and undergrowth so thick that a man could not walk upright or see more than a few yards. The engineers went first, cutting the trail that came to be called the Maruyama Trail. They could not cut fast enough. The division following behind them piled up behind the delays. The trail ran south from the Japanese assembly area at Cochabamba, then turned east to cross the Matanacaw and Lunga rivers south of Mount Austin, and followed the Lunga downstream toward the American perimeter. Much of it went through terrain so steep and so thickly vegetated that men carrying heavy loads had to haul themselves upright using ropes and the trunks of trees. The jungle canopy closed out the sky. Compasses were unreliable in some sections because of the magnetic properties of the volcanic rock underneath. The rain was near constant. Men fell out from exhaustion and disease and the weight of their equipment. The artillery pieces, dragged and shoved and hauled through the jungle with ropes and manpower, eventually had to be abandoned where they stood. Some units lost their way entirely in the dark and had to be redirected. Soldiers whose boots had rotted through by the second week cut their feet on roots and volcanic stone and kept walking. The attack that was supposed to be launched on October 22nd was delayed, then delayed again. What was planned as a 5-day approach march took 13 days. The men who arrived at the southern edge of the American perimeter were the survivors of an ordeal that had already cost Maruyama a significant fraction of his combat power before a single shot was fired at an American position. When they arrived, they were expected to immediately assault a Marine defensive perimeter held by men who, however sick and tired themselves, had been living in their fighting positions for weeks and knew every piece of ground in front of them. While Maruyama was still working his way through the jungle, the broader Japanese assault had already opened with attacks elsewhere on the perimeter. On the night of October 23rd, Japanese tanks and infantry attacked the Marine lines from the west along the beach road at the Guadalcanal River mouth. Marine anti-tank guns and artillery stopped the tanks. 40 Marine howitzers dropped more than 6,000 rounds on the Japanese infantry in the massed approach, and the screams from the Japanese positions could be heard by the Marines during the pauses in firing. When the Marines checked the area the next morning, they found roughly 600 dead. The attack from the west, the one that could not proceed without Maruyama's breakthrough from the south, had already failed. That failure made the southern assault more urgent. Maruyama had one chance to salvage the operation. His men, hungry and sick and exhausted from the march, would have to do what the tanks and the Western infantry had not. The official U.S. Army history records the enveloping force at approximately 5,600 infantry plus supporting troops, divided into two wings with a reserve. The left wing under Major General Yumio Nasu consisted of the 29th Infantry Regiment. Kawaguchi's right wing was composed of elements of the 124th and 230th Infantry. The reserve held the 16th Infantry Regiment, the force that hit the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines on the night of October 25th to 26th was drawn primarily from this structure. Multiple post-war accounts, including those drawing on Japanese records, put the strength of the Japanese regiment attacking in Paige's specific sector at approximately 2,500 to 2,700 men. The title of this episode says 4,000. Popular accounts and commemorative pieces have used figures ranging from 3,000 to 4,000 for what Paige faced. The documented range in the post-war record is 2,500 to 2,700 at the point of contact with his position, within a total enveloping force of over 5,600. All of these figures were more than enough, working through jungle in the dark, to overrun 33 Marines on a ridge. The inflation in the popular telling is not necessary to make the story remarkable. It is already remarkable at the numbers the record actually supports. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines arrived at their assigned ridgeline position on the evening of October 25th. They had conducted a forced march from their previous location near Henderson Field, moving under fire. Japanese howitzers on the west bank of the Guadalcanal River were already putting shells on the ridge. Japanese destroyers offshore added to the bombardment. The Marines dug in, getting their positions sorted in the dark under incoming rounds, the sound of Japanese artillery mixing with the rain that fell almost every evening in that season on Guadalcanal. Colonel Hannikin deployed his 3 rifle companies along the east-west ridgeline, with Company E holding the lower ground to the west, Company G on the saddle in the center, and Company F on the higher ground to the east. The terrain the battalion was defending was a saddle and high ground feature between 2 hills, facing south toward a ravine that the jungle came closest to the American lines. Anyone attacking from Maruyama's direction would have to come up through that ravine or through the jungle flanking it, and the ravine was the route that offered any coherent formation. Between Companies F and G, Paige positioned his 4 machine guns. The weapons were water-cooled Browning M1917s, each capable of sustained fire for as long as the water jacket held and the ammunition held, firing 30 caliber rounds at a cyclic rate of 4 to 600 per minute. He set them to cover the ravine to the south, overlapping their fields of fire so that the floor of the ravine was covered from multiple angles. Then the Marines began lobbing mortar rounds into the ravine to work on whatever was assembling in the jungle below them. Before he settled in to wait, he went out in front of his position in the dark. He crawled forward and strung a tripwire along the most likely axis of Japanese approach. At intervals on the wire, he set empty Sirashin cans, and inside each can he placed a spent cartridge case that would rattle when the can was disturbed. It took time to do this carefully in the dark and the rain with Japanese shells falling on the ridge. He did it anyway. He had been a machine gunner for 6 years. He said later that he required every man in his section to be able to field strip the water-cooled Browning, the 1903 Springfield, and the .45 caliber pistol blindfolded. The care he put into rigging the trip wire the evening of October 25th was the same habit expressed in a different form. The Marines around him knew the attack was coming. Sergeant Ralph Briggs, serving as a scout approximately 3,000 yards in front of the main American line, had telephoned Hannikin's battalion command post at around 9:30 on the night of October 24th to report Japanese forces massing in the jungle. He had been close enough to hear them. Briggs and 46 other Marines had been sent out as a listening post and tripwire of their own, a human early warning in advance of Paige's Medal 1. Briggs told the command post there were approximately 3,000 Japanese moving through his position. He could hear them singing and smoking cigarettes in the dark. Hannikin relayed the report up the chain. The Marines on the ridge settled in. The rain came and went in the way it did on Guadalcanal in that season, arriving without warning and departing the same way, leaving the ground wet and the air heavy. The mortar crews kept working the ravine below the position, lobbing rounds into the darkness where the Japanese were moving into their jump-off positions. The machine gunners checked their water jackets, checked their belts, adjusted the traversing mechanisms by feel. A water-cooled Browning M1917 is not a complicated weapon, but it demands attention. The water jacket has to be full. The feed mechanism has to be clear. The headspace has to be correct, or the weapon will jam at the worst possible moment. Paige had spent 6 years making sure his men understood these things in daylight. He had spent the last several hours making sure the guns were right in the dark. Then he waited. Every Marine on that ridge had enough experience of Guadalcanal at night to know that waiting was its own form of sustained effort, not passive but active, listening for sounds in the jungle that should not be there, watching the tree line for movement that was not wind, managing the particular kind of fear that comes in the quiet before an event that cannot be stopped, only met. The Japanese struck at 3 in the morning. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Company F, on the higher ground to the east, took the worst of the initial assault. The attack was not a probe. Maruyama's regiment came through the ravine and up toward the ridgeline in waves, the soldiers shouting as they advanced, a noise that survivors described as both terrifying and disorienting in the dark, the sound of a force that had organized itself for a single decisive push after weeks of building toward this moment. The Japanese knew the terrain. Their maps of the area east of the Matanacaw were accurate. They came up the ravine that Paige's guns were covering, and when his C-ration cans rattled in the dark, the guns opened up. The first volleys cut into the Japanese assault. The muzzle flash of the water-cooled Brownings lit the ravine briefly, repeatedly, in the particular strobe of sustained automatic fire. Men went down in the ravine. More came up behind them. The Japanese regiment had been building toward this attack for 2 weeks of miserable march through the worst jungle on the island. They were not going to stop for machine gun fire. The grenades began coming in shortly after the guns opened up, Japanese soldiers throwing as they climbed, and the Marines on the ridge threw back. The sound of the fighting along the ridgeline was a sustained, overlapping noise. Machine gun fire and rifle fire, and the detonation of grenades, and the shouting of men in 2 languages, and underneath all of it the sound of the jungle, which does not stop for any of this. Marines on Company F's front were fighting at the parapet of their positions, firing into men who were close enough to see. When the Japanese came over the crest in some places, the fighting became hand-to-hand. The heavy machine guns worked. The Browning M1917 was a weapon designed for sustained fire in exactly this kind of engagement, a fixed defensive position firing into an approaching enemy, and at the ranges that were opening up as the Japanese came up the ravine, the gun was doing what it was built to do. The problem was the weight of the assault. The regiment had more men than the position had bullets available in any given minute, and the regiment kept coming. Ammunition handlers ran belts forward. When a belt ran out on one gun, the gunner shifted to the spare while another man loaded. The rhythm of sustained fire is as demanding as any other physical work, and it was happening in the rain, in the dark, under fire. In the close fighting that followed on the ridgeline itself, a Japanese soldier came at Paige directly and thrust his bayonet at Paige's head. Paige threw up his left hand to block the blade. The bayonet cut deeply into the palm and fingers, opening the hand severely and coming near to severing the fingers. He killed the man with his K-bar fighting knife. One by one, the men of his section were hit. Some were killed outright in the assault. Others went down wounded and could not continue at their guns. The two rifle companies positioned behind Paige's machine gun section came under overwhelming pressure of their own and eventually fell back a short distance to reform their lines, which had the effect of isolating Paige's position entirely, leaving his guns and the man running them exposed, with Japanese forces pressing from the south and now sweeping past on both flanks. At some point during the fighting, a Marine from one of the rifle platoons reached Paige and began feeding ammunition. He was killed at the gun. Paige moved to the next position. He found one of his own men, badly wounded, still trying to operate the gun. He took over. That man did not survive the night. What the record establishes is that through the second and third hours of the battle, the section was being systematically reduced, man by man, gun by gun, the perimeter of Paige's effective control contracting around him as the Japanese pressure mounted, until there was nothing left to contract. By the third hour, Paige was the only man on the gun still fighting. The decision he made in that moment is the one that the record documents with complete clarity, corroborated by his own account, by the Medal of Honor citation, and by the testimony of Marines who were nearby when the outcome finally became apparent. He ran from gun to gun in the dark, feeding belts and firing, and moving to the next position and firing again. He did this to create the impression that more men were present on the ridge than there were. In the dark, on a contested ridgeline with incoming fire from multiple directions, the sound of different guns firing from different positions could plausibly suggest a manned line. One man running between four guns was not a manned line. In the dark, at 3 in the morning, with Japanese soldiers already sweeping past him, it was close enough to the impression of one to matter. The physical reality of what he was doing should be held clearly in mind. The Browning M1917 weighed approximately 33 pounds unloaded. The water in the water jacket added another 7 or 8 pounds. A full belt of 250 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition weighed approximately 7 pounds. He was moving between gun positions in the dark on a ridgeline that was being swept with Japanese fire, with a left hand that had been opened to the bone by a bayonet, picking up and moving and feeding weapons by feel and by memory, going back to training that was 6 years deep and performing it under conditions that no training exercise could replicate. He did not have the luxury of thinking about whether this was possible. It was either possible or Henderson Field fell. He kept moving. When one of the machine guns was destroyed by enemy fire, he left it and moved to the next. His wounded left hand kept working because there was nothing else for it to do. Company F was ultimately driven from the eastern position. Japanese soldiers broke through the gap and swept past Paige's section. He swiveled the gun toward the movement and fired into it. He was no longer holding a line. He was the last fixed point on a ridge that had otherwise been overrun, one man with a water-cooled machine gun and a left hand that would need a surgeon whenever he found one. Maruyama, at his command post through the night, received conflicting reports. A field telephone call came in reporting success. The right wing had reached the airfield. A second call came shortly after to correct it. The men had crossed a large open field in the dark and believed it was the airfield. They had not reached it. The volume of American mortar and artillery fire was not diminishing. It was increasing. The general understood what that meant. Elsewhere on the perimeter, other elements of the Japanese assault were also failing. Oka's force on the western flank, which was supposed to coordinate its attack with Maruyama's, had not reached its jump-off position on time. The coordinated assault that the Japanese plan required had become instead a series of uncoordinated, sequential battering ram attacks against a defensive line that was prepared for each one separately. The Marine artillery, 40 howitzers working registered fire plans, dropped rounds into every Japanese assembly area that had been identified. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Puller to the west of Hannikin's position, was fighting its own engagement. Puller himself had been moving up and down his lines through the night, at one point calling higher headquarters to report that his left flank was under attack and requesting reinforcements, then calling back minutes later to say never mind. He had handled it with what he had. The Japanese were hitting a perimeter that was, despite everything it had been through in 2 months, still coherent and still fighting. The light came at the eastern horizon a little before 6 in the morning. In the tropics, dawn arrives quickly once it begins, going from gray to bright in the span of minutes. That first light showed Paige a ground covered in bodies, American and Japanese, scattered across the ridge and in the ravine below it. He could also see Japanese soldiers reforming in the ravine for what was clearly a final push, a last attempt to break through before the daylight made movement impossible. What he did next, Paige described in his own words in multiple accounts over the following decades, and the accounts are consistent with each other. He draped 2 cartridge belts over his shoulders. He loaded the machine gun with a 3rd belt and unclamped it from its mounting. He cradled the gun in his arms. His left hand, the hand the bayonet had opened to the bone in the dark hours earlier, was the hand that held the weapon steady. He turned toward the Marines of Company G, who had withdrawn to his right rear through the night, and he shouted, "Fix bayonets and follow me." Then he charged down the hill. He fired the Browning from the hip as he went down the slope. Below him in the kanai grass, a Japanese officer stood with roughly 18 men around him. Paige fired into them. They fell. The officer remained standing. Paige was 4 feet from him when the officer drew his samurai sword from its scabbard. Paige fired a burst, and the burst cut the officer down before the sword cleared. Behind Paige, the Marines of Company G and a group of rear echelon troops that the battalion's executive officer had assembled through the night came charging down the ridge with fixed bayonets. Clerks and cooks and men pulled from the battalion's support elements. Anyone who could hold a rifle had been gathered during the fighting and now came down the slope with the men of G Company. The yelling of the charge mixing with the rattle of the Browning. Paige was still firing from the hip. The Japanese soldiers in the ravine, who had been advancing and fighting in the dark for 3 hours, who had lost enormous numbers in the approach and in the assault on the ridge, who had believed in the final minutes before dawn that one more push might break through to the airfield, saw what was coming at them from the ridgeline and began to fall back. Paige said later that the counterattack, the sight of American Marines coming down the ridge behind him with fixed bayonets while he was still firing, was the greatest thing he had ever seen. The fighting at the bottom of the slope finished quickly. The Japanese fell back into the jungle. When the shooting finally stopped that morning, 98 Japanese bodies were counted on the ridge itself. Another 200 lay in the ravine below. Across the full perimeter during the battle for Henderson Field, burial details in the days following counted 1,462 Japanese dead in the area of the Lunga perimeter. Maruyama's force, which had entered the jungle south of Henderson Field with over 5,600 infantry, emerged having lost nearly half its strength and having failed to take the airfield. The 29th Regiment, the unit most directly engaged in Paige's sector, had effectively ceased to exist as a combat formation. Maruyama, according to accounts of his own words that night, said it was finished when the final report came in. Most of the 29th had been wiped out, and the regiment's battle flag was missing. A Japanese major, one of the officers from the 29th, wrote in his diary before taking his own life the next day, agonizing over the loss of his men and his regiment's standard. He wrote that he did not know what excuse to give. The surviving remnants of Maruyama's force began their retreat back through the jungle. They carried their wounded out on the same trail they had marched in on, through the same ridges and ravines and tangled undergrowth, now in reverse, moving through jungle that had already cost them severely on the approach. The survivors who emerged from the Maruyama Trail weeks later were, by most accounts, barely recognizable as soldiers from the formation that had entered it. They abandoned more equipment along the way. Men who had been weakened by the approach march and then broken by the assault died on the withdrawal. The Sendai Division, one of the Japanese Army's established formations with a record in China and the early Pacific campaigns, had been effectively destroyed as an offensive instrument by the Marines defending the Lunga perimeter. In the immediate aftermath, sitting in his foxhole still bleeding, Paige searched through his pack for something to stop the bleeding. His small Bible fell out. It opened to Proverbs 3 verse 5. His mother had written the verse in the margins when he left home in 1936. The verse reads, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." He held the Bible in his dirty and bloodied hands and read the words his mother had written in the margin. He said decades later that he could scarcely believe it when the Bible fell open to exactly that passage in that moment, and that he took it for what it was. He was 24 years old. He had been fighting for 3 hours alone on a jungle ridge with a machine gun and a wounded hand. 33 men who had been under his command the evening before were dead or wounded. He was still breathing because of a combination of things: 6 years of training, a tripwire made from C-ration cans, the stamina to run from gun to gun in the dark, the willingness to charge down a hill at dawn carrying a machine gun with a bayonet wound in his hand. And now a Bible open to the right page. He was a practical man, not a theatrical one. He put the Bible back in his pack and started thinking about what came next. Paige stayed on Guadalcanal until January 1943. On December 19, 1942, he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the field. The Medal of Honor recommendation had been approved, but the presentation would come later. On May 21, 1943, in Melbourne, Australia, Major General Vandegrift, now elevated to full general and serving as Commandant of the Marine Corps, pinned the Medal of Honor on Mitchell Paige. Vandegrift told him he was the first enlisted Marine in the 1st Marine Division to receive it. Standing at the same ceremony was Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, who had held a different section of the Henderson Field perimeter on the same night against a different portion of the same Japanese assault. Basilone's section of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under Colonel Chesty Puller, had stopped another element of Maruyama's force from breaking through and reaching the airfield from a different angle. In the hours before Puller's battalion knew what was happening on Hannikin's front, Puller had heard firing from that direction and had a simple, direct reaction to it. He sent men. The executive officer who assembled the rear echelon troops that came down the slope behind Paige at dawn was working on Puller's orders and on his own initiative in equal measure. The two Medal of Honor recipients, Paige and Basilone, were photographed together at that Melbourne ceremony in May 1943 with Vandegrift and the Medal of Honor citation documents. The photograph exists in the public record. Two young men from opposite ends of the country, one from the steel towns of Pennsylvania, one from a small town in New Jersey, both of whom had spent a single night in October 1942 on a jungle island doing things that neither could have fully anticipated or prepared for in any training program ever devised. Both of them alive. Both of them, by all accounts, more interested in talking about the men who were not. Paige's response when Vandegrift pinned the medal on him is the one that should probably be remembered most clearly. He said, "This Medal of Honor belongs to all 33 men in my platoon on Guadalcanal." The battle for Henderson Field was the last serious Japanese ground offensive on Guadalcanal, and its failure set off a sequence that within a few months would close the campaign entirely. In November 1942, the Japanese made one more attempt to reinforce the island through what became the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, 3 days of fighting in the waters north of the island that cost both sides heavily. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, a cruiser, and most of the transport convoy carrying the 38th Division's infantry and equipment. The transports that were beached on Guadalcanal were destroyed from the air before most of their cargo could be unloaded. The Japanese Navy had taken losses it could not easily absorb in waters it had previously dominated. From that point forward, the Japanese position on Guadalcanal was a slow attrition rather than a contested campaign. The soldiers already on the island were receiving inadequate supplies and no reinforcements worth the name. Malaria and starvation were taking more of them than the Marines were. The men who had marched in on the Maruyama Trail and survived the assault on the perimeter were now dying of other causes, slowly, in the jungle, without the means to evacuate the wounded or resupply the living. By late January 1943, the Japanese High Command had authorized an evacuation. In the first week of February, roughly 10,000 surviving Japanese soldiers were loaded onto destroyers in the dark and removed from the island. It was a skilled and well-executed extraction, and it saved the lives of the men who made it. The 6-month campaign for Guadalcanal, which had begun with the Marine landings on August 7th, was over. Henderson Field had held. The Cactus Air Force kept flying. The island chain that runs northeast from Guadalcanal became the axis of the Allied advance through the central and southwestern Pacific, island by island, month by month, toward Bougainville and New Britain and eventually the Philippines. The war did not end quickly, but the direction of it changed at Guadalcanal, and the direction was fixed by men like the ones on that ridge in October. Paige continued serving after Guadalcanal. He fought at Cape Gloucester in late 1943, on New Britain, during the 1st Marine Division's subsequent Pacific operations. He eventually retired from the Marine Corps as a colonel in 1964, 28 years after hitchhiking to Baltimore at 18 to enlist. The Marine Corps that commissioned him a second lieutenant on Guadalcanal in December 1942 had, by the time he retired, sent him through the Korean War and through the years of the Cold War, through a career that ended in the grade of colonel with all of the institutional distance from a foxhole that such a career entails. In his later years, he became a liaison with the FBI to pursue men who fraudulently claimed the Medal of Honor, working without pay to expose imposters, and pressing Congress to increase the penalties for doing so. He was not gentle about it. He said in one interview that he could not arrest these people before he got together with the FBI, but that he scared the hell out of them and had gotten some of the medals back. He was precise about the reason for his investment in it. The medal, in his understanding, did not belong to him personally. It belonged to the men in his section. The fraudulent use of it was an offense against them. He had said in Melbourne in 1943 that the medal belonged to all 33 men in his platoon, and he had meant it, and he kept meaning it for the rest of his life. He died November 15, 2003, at his home in La Quinta, California. He was 85 years old. He was, at his death, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Guadalcanal campaign. He was buried at Riverside National Cemetery with full military honors. There is a detail in the accounts of that morning that stays with you if you sit with it long enough. After the counterattack ended and the last Japanese soldiers had retreated into the jungle and the firing stopped, the landscape in front of the ridge was blanketed with the dead. The tropical sun was coming up over the Solomon Sea, which was the color of deep water in early morning light. The jungle was beginning its ordinary morning noise, birds and insects. The sound in equatorial forest makes it dawn regardless of what was done in it during the night. Paige stood in that light, still holding the machine gun, still bleeding from the wound on his hand. He had gone into that night with 33 men under his command. He was coming out of it alone. What the record allows us to say about this moment is limited by what any record can capture. The official citation, written in the formal language of a military decoration, speaks of extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry and fearless determination. Those words are accurate in the sense that they describe what happened. They are the language of institutional recognition, which is a different instrument from the language of experience. What actually happened on that ridge in those hours is something that neither a Medal of Honor citation nor any documentary can fully recover, because it happened in the dark, in the wet, with a wounded hand on a gun barrel, surrounded by men who were going down and could not get back up. Paige had arrived at Guadalcanal as a platoon sergeant who had spent 6 years learning one specific weapon well enough to teach every man in his section to operate it blindfolded. He had seen the Japanese army in operation in China in 1938 from a moving train, and he understood what it was. He had rigged a tripwire with empty Sirashin cans and spent cartridge cases the evening before the attack, because that was what you did if you had been paying attention. When the attack came and the men around him were gone, and the choice was whether to stay on the guns or step back from the ridge, he stayed. The 33 men of his section deserve to be named, and the record, though it does not preserve all of their individual names in a single accessible document, preserves what they did. They held their positions under the assault of a Japanese regiment until they could not hold them any longer. Some of them were killed in the first terrible minutes of the attack. Others lasted longer. They did not give the ridge up without cost. Paige was right that the medal belonged to them. He was also right, in a way he may not have intended, when he said it publicly at a ceremony in Melbourne in front of the general who commanded the division. The battle was a collective act, 34 men on a ridge with 4 guns and a tripwire made from Sirashin cans, reduced one by one through the night until one man was left, and that man kept the guns running because the 33 men who were no longer able to had set the example and the standard that made it possible. Remember them. I will see you at the next 0 hour. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.